Good evening. Welcome tonight to People Communicating Across the Fence or the Aisle. This is our last topic on truth in politics. Next month, we will not be here next week. Next month in April, 4, 11, and 18, we will be looking at economics in 3 different ways. The first way we'll be looking at poverty in the United States. There'll be a New York Times journalist in economics who will be talking about that. And in the middle section will be Amy Lerman, University of Berkeley political scientist, who will look at what are the ramifications of the United States, a public crisis, she calls it, the United States not believing in the efficiency and effectiveness of government. And I learned over the last maybe 2 years somewhere that that statement that I heard in childhood, oh, it's good enough for government work, it was kind of a, not very good work. It originally started as, if it was good enough for government, it was very fine. It was excellent work. And so how did we get twisted? And the third night will be one of the authors of a book called American Amnesia. And he looks at, or they look at, the times when the government has done excellently, and they too see that people no longer believe it. And that one, the middle one will be more abstraction, and the third one will be more details about actual realities. So can we think differently about government, and what difference will it make if we do? Tonight, I welcome all of you. The supporters have been, as they have been from the beginning. We thank so very much Michigan Humanities, as well as Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. Kathy Organ, Thomas Trahey, Kathy Calabretta, Mike McKinney, Matt Sanderson, and I, Brooke Portman, have been the organizers of the events. Eric Smith is director of the MCDL, Mason County District Library. The staff, the board contribute financially also to the program in addition to staff. Sue Carlson, who's been here every night in our audience just about, does all of our press releases, and Lisa Daines does the website. Never want to feed the body without, or never want to feed the mind without feeding the body too. And so here in the room are still, again, coffee and some sweets, molasses brownies, no chocolate in those, but there is chocolate in the cookies. Hope people at home have their drink, beverage, or whatever to treat them while they're learning. Some tech notes are that if the sound goes out, we here will notice it, usually on Zoom. The folks in the audience on Zoom and our speaker on Zoom will not know it. We all just need to pause a little till Thomas re-gets the connection again, and then Thomas will let the speaker know that he needs to repeat. So, but just bear with us. We didn't have it last week. We did have it the first week, the week before, that is to say. So I will once again ask the questions from the chat. And Nathan will go around in this room and give the people here who have questions the microphone. That way, both the Zoom audience can hear questions from here, and we can hear the Zoom audience questions. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to work. So tonight, people communicating over the fence or across the aisle. This is not about how to argue better. All of us want to build better arguments, but it's not about winning. It's not a debate. It's to learn how to ask questions and handle ourselves so we learn to hear without judgment, so that we can ask questions with curiosity and to find out what another believes and what do they value, and how is what they believe and what they value making the world for them, would make the world for them a better place. We want that same respect given back to us as well. So how did I find our speaker tonight, Brian Harrison? Well, I have to say, for a good couple of years, I have been looking at many different books on communication, in part because in 2016, I visited a brother and sister-in-law, and I arrived by saying, gosh, I'd love to have a conversation with you folks about why you voted as you did and why I voted as I did. And my sister-in-law turned to me and said, Brooke, we don't need to hear you. We already know what you think. Mm-hmm. And I said, you mean you don't think if things would go better and whatever if we really talked about it? Nope, I don't. And that was sort of the end of it. And so they continued to talk about the news while the news was going on every night, but I did not. I just sat there and went, okay. So that's what it is. And ever since then, I've been looking how to talk, especially to our families. You'd think we'd have some kind of common language, but so Brian's book, A Change is Going to Come, How to Have Effective Political Conversations in a Divided America, I found to be different from many of the communication books. One, it was out there in the real world. So many of the ones about communication are about, teaching students, and Brian's is about, talking to other adults. And I couldn't tell when I read the book itself, not looking at where he came from or what he's doing in other places, what side of the fence he was on. I thought that's a good person to have come when I can't tell. And then he practices what he preaches, I found. He shares information, he is curious, and it seems to me through the book he listens. So, Brian Harrison has a PhD from Northwestern University. Early on, he was a White House appointee for the Department of Homeland Security. Then he went to, let me talk about, then he left there and went into academia on the teaching side. So he's taught at Northwestern, Yale, NYU, New York University, and Wesleyan University. He's been a lecturer at the U of M Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and he is currently, also in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, he's been a visiting professor at Macalester College. He is now, I was jumping to Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, a very fine 4-year liberal arts college there. He is founder and president of Voters for Equality and encouraging voting among LGBTQ. We are very honored and lucky to have Brian join us here tonight. And Thomas is going to show Brian very soon. Let's pull him up. There he is. Let's welcome Brian. He is spending the first official night of spring break with us. So let us all thank him very much. And please help me welcome Brian Harrison to Shifting Landscapes.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here tonight, even on spring break. Spring break is a little bit of a misnomer, and it's not much of a break anyway. So happy to be here talking about my book. In just a moment, I'll start a PowerPoint presentation that will take about 45 minutes or so. And it'll take you through some of the larger themes of the book. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments at the end, which in my experience is usually the most fun part for everybody. So if you bear with me for a bit of the presentation, we'll have plenty of time to talk to each other at the end. I start with a story. I was born in February, and when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, my birthday landed on President's Day. And my grandfather told me, well, if you're born on President's Day, you're going to become president of the United States someday. Aww. And as a little kid, kind of panicked. I thought, well, that's a big job. I had better get to reading the news and figuring out what's going on in the world. And so before I was really able to understand what's going on, I would watch the nightly news, I would read the newspaper, and I thought it was my civic duty to do all of those things. And as I've gotten older, it seems less likely that I'll be president of the United States, though I'm not holding out hope, I guess. But that sense of understanding what's going on in the world, understanding what's going on with each other, was instilled in me as an important thing from a really young age. And I think that's what drew me to work for the federal government for a bit. It's what's drawn me to work in political science and teach. And of course, it's my impetus for writing my book. So without further ado, I'll share the PowerPoint. Here we go. That's the cover. Change is going to come with Oxford University Press. And yes, I realize that Florida is not in the right place, nor is New England, but that's how they drew the cover. So one quotation that means a lot to me was spoken by Audre Lorde in a speech in 1980. And what she said was, "We sometimes find it difficult to deal constructively with the genuine differences between us.
Mark Lovington.
And to recognize that unity does not require we be identical to each other." And the reason that it's so meaningful to me is it underscores the point that it's okay that we're not the same. It's okay that we disagree. And in coming together to tackle important problems and big questions, it isn't that we all have to think the same thing or be the same person. There's something else that's even more important to deliberative democracy. And those important things are what I'll be talking about tonight. So I think we can amicably agree that it's a pretty chaotic time in American politics. When people ask me what I'd study, and I tell them American politics, public opinion, political communication, they mostly roll their eyes or say, oh God, that sounds awful. And I laugh, I can see why you think that. There's a lot going on. There was violence on January 6th. There are norms being broken and institutions being questioned by candidates and elected officials. There are assessments of the United States as a backsliding democracy, one that is, if not failed, failing. There is rampant misinformation and simply false information. And there's many reasons to think that the Congress and elected officials are highly polarized, and perhaps we, the citizenry, are as well. So again, I think we can all agree, things are great right now. So a lot of people in my life say, well, I give up. That's it, we're done. Let's wave the wave flag, and move on. I'm not going to talk to other people. I don't really care if they talk to me. And I think that's the worst way to look at what's going on right now. So all is not lost. Social science research has a lot to tell us about the way we form attitudes and the way we can change them. We just have to listen to what the research tells us. It's not easy, but it works. Interpersonal communication matters. We pay a lot of time and attention talking about news media, talking about social media, but we don't often talk about interpersonal communication, how we talk to the people around us. And I think that might be, if not more important, at least as important as the news media and social media. And one overarching point is not every political conversation has to be about persuading. Sometimes it can be about listening. Sometimes it can be just curiosity about what someone else thinks. But the reality is, persuasion in the sort of normative sense is a really slow and deliberative process. And we're going to talk about what persuasion is and what it isn't. But I think that the larger point is we should take a moment to breathe and to sort of reorient ourselves to the things in our lives, in our political lives, that we can change, and not ignore, but maybe downplay the things that we can't. So what does that look like? The problem isn't that we disagree. Disagreement, divergence, even division in some cases, are a facet of deliberative democracy. They're a facet of our country since its very beginning. The problem isn't that we disagree, it's how we do it. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I've noticed over the last several years, lots of people say they want peace and harmony. They want us to all get along. And they remember fondly days of the past when politics was more civil. And it's hard to deny that that's true. There was a time when we could talk to each other who talked to other people who thought differently and felt differently about the world than we did. However, despite people wanting this change, I've noticed few do anything to change their behavior. So this thing is really good, but me individually, no, I'm not going to do anything to try to get there. So a few examples of how I've seen this. Social media is not a great place to talk about politics. It's a place to feel like you're winning a conversation. And that's not what we want. There's so many more media outlets that we can choose. Some of them are entertainment based, some of them are political based. But regardless, it's becoming easier and easier to choose media based on our existing beliefs, so we don't have to challenge ourselves. And political psychologists tell us that there are phenomena like selective exposure, motivated reasoning, some of these technical terms, that essentially say that we prefer to listen to and read and engage with information that we already agree with. It just makes us feel better. And that makes sense. And if you look at where you get your information, if you use social media, or if you use one of these news algorithms, Google, Apple News, even some of the news sources, ABC, CBS, Fox, you're not actually getting news as it happens. You're getting news as they want you to see it. And that's not a great development. But like I mentioned, we need disagreement. Can you imagine what America would look like if we were not allowed to disagree with each other and to express the disagreement? That would be far worse than what we see, where we see ourselves now. So if you looked at some of the political philosophers who founded our country, J.S. Mill, the Federalist Papers, they talk about division, they talk about disagreement, and the founders built it into our political system. It's in fact part of our constitutional process. We're able to change our constitution if something happens that we disagree with. So again, it isn't that we disagree with each other that's the problem. It's we're not doing it very well on an interpersonal level. Now, this is probably really small, so those of you in the room can't see it, but those of you on Zoom hopefully can. I want to make an argument to you that we actually agree a lot more than you might think. And this is in chapter 7 of my book. But there are some big political and social issues that we actually agree quite a bit on. So one, protecting healthcare coverage for people with pre-existing conditions is supported by 93% of Democrats, 89% of the American public writ large, and 91% of Republicans. That's pretty amazing. And if you go down the list, there's any number of issues that you might think we're terribly divided on. And even some of those issues where we are, there's more agreement than you might think. For example, when asked whether someone's comfortable with stricter gun control laws, 87% of Democrats agree, which probably doesn't surprise you, but 42% of Republicans agree, 42%. Now that's not a majority, of course, but that's more than you might think. So isn't there room in between the 42 and the 87 to find something that can work for everyone? And that's the case for from issues from the minimum wage to immigration to whether a person who's convicted of a felony should be allowed to vote. So it feels like we're so divided, and in many ways we are, but we tend to forget about the many ways that we're not. And so I want to walk through ways that we have found work to talk to people who disagree with us and help us have productive and effective political conversations. One of the canons of political science scholarship is political opinions, public opinion, is really stable over time. It doesn't change. In the aggregate, if you take sort of a big picture, it doesn't change very quickly. And these are two books within the last 30 or 40 years that make this point quantitatively, but hopefully you believe me. And the interesting part is, this is true even for very contentious, hot button political and social issues. Things that you might think sort of change quickly and sort of go up and down over time. Things like abortion, the death penalty, gun rights, taxes. This is actually pretty stable over time. And if you don't believe me, here are some data. If you look at the question of whether gun control or firearm control should be more strict, less strict, or kept as they are now, these are the results over the last 30 years or so. Yes, there has change. It's gone. People who think that it should be more strict has gone from 78% to 52%. But it's a pretty flat line if you look at it and squint. If you close one eye and squint with the other one, it's a flatter line than you might expect. Even more so is asking about abortion. If you ask folks, do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, legal under certain circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances, from 1975 until today, it's a pretty darn flat line. Now, again, it has gone up and has gone down, depending on news events or depending on various things. This is a pretty flat line over time, especially over a 45-year period. There are exceptions. Marijuana, legalizing marijuana is one exception. It's not the one I'm going to talk about tonight. The one I'm going to talk about tonight is LGBTQ rights, the rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. And the one that we're probably most familiar with is same-sex marriage. In 1996, when this question was first asked in the United States, Do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages? Only 27% of Americans agreed that they should be valid. And in 2021, that number is roughly 70%. This is a really, really unusual development in public opinion change. This doesn't happen this quickly over this quick of a timeline. And if you look at another measure, talking about gay relationships, you see an even slightly longer timeline. In 1987, 57% of people thought that gay relationships should be illegal, and only 32% thought they should be legal, and you see that flipped over this time period, the 72-24. Now again, this is really strange. This is not what we would expect. And so what I wanted to know, I asked a very sophisticated social science question: what's going on? Why have we seen this change? And the answer is in my first book, not the one that I'll be focusing on tonight, but it's relevant for our discussion tonight too. What we found in our first book is there are a whole bunch of reasons that we've seen this change, from advocacy campaigns, people spending time and money trying to change hearts and minds. Second is something called cohort replacement. It has to do with surveys, and with younger people being included in public opinion surveys and older people not as commonly being part of these surveys, that accounts for some of the change as well. Third, media exposure. And there are just more LGBTQ people in movies and TV being talked about on the news. That certainly has an effect. What our book looks at is interpersonal contact, and in particular with members of in-groups. Now what this means is, as people who are in groups that you perceive that you yourself are also in change their mind, so too will you. For example, President Obama famously came out in support of same-sex marriage in 2012. And there was a poll in Maryland on a Friday that asked this question: do you support marriages for gay people or not? And overwhelmingly, a Black population of Maryland said no. I think it was about 65-35 that said we don't support. Over the weekend, President Obama expressed his support, and on Monday, there happened to be another wave of the survey, and they asked the same question. And over the weekend, it totally flipped. 65-70% of people said yes, I do support same-sex marriage, and 25-30% said that they don't. And it can be almost wholly attributed to President Obama saying that he supported it. And that's because he's a member of the in-group of the people that were asked the question. The Black people who lived in Maryland saw this cue and said, oh, okay, this leader of our group thinks this thing. Either maybe we should reconsider, or that gives us permission to say what we've thought all along, that we agree as well. And of course, President Obama isn't the only example. There are dozens and hundreds of folks who lead these sorts of groups. Former Vice President Dick Cheney is another one who came out in support of same-sex marriage and support of his daughter, and made a real difference among Republicans and conservatives who rethought the issue and listened to what he had to say, because he was a leader of a group that was really important to them. So the point of bringing up that specific example was, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from this remarkable change, and what might we apply it to other areas of our political life? So there are three things. One is having visibility and perceived closeness, thinking people around me think this thing, and maybe I should too, or at least maybe I'll consider it, was really important. The second was the message. People didn't say, you're an idiot that you disagree with me. No, they said, tell me what you think. And they'd listen and say, okay, well, here's what I think, and here's why I think it. And that was really powerful. And it was done in a systematic way, like no other advocacy campaign in American history. The third was a diversity of speakers, because everyone listens to different cues. Everyone reads different news, trusts different people. It was having a group as diverse as Barack Obama and Dick Cheney giving the same message that really made a wide scale difference. So I include this, these aren't my kids, but they could be. There are Batmen and Spider-Men all over the world. We have groups of people that are like us, and people that aren't, and that's fine. That's how it's going to be. We create our identity based on our membership with or not with groups that we see around us, and we enforce those boundaries as a means of understanding who we are and how we exist in the social world. Some work done in the 1970s and 1980s proved that this is just human nature. We make sense of ourselves and others based on the categories that we put them in and ourselves in, and that's how we go through life. It isn't necessarily a problem, but it can be. And one of the reasons that it can be a problem is we tend to like people who are in our group more than people who are in the other group. And we know that from decades of research. We know that we not only like people, but we will privilege them. If we have money given to us that we can distribute, we're more likely to give it to our in-group than our out-group. We will choose group members for any number of things before we choose out-group members. In an interesting study, we actually find in-group members more physically attractive than we find out-group members, even when it's the same exact person. So this is when the problem comes in, right? Having categories of folks, understanding who's like us and who isn't, that's not a problem. But when we start to privilege those only who are like us to the detriment of people who aren't, that's when we can run into some trouble. So back to the original question, how do we move forward in political communication, political conversation in a way that's going to be fruitful for everyone? Well, we have some headwinds, let's be honest. We're in an increasingly sorted culture. As I mentioned at the beginning, we get our information from sources we already agree with, but we tend to live near and speak to and be friends with people who are like us, both in terms of identity and in terms of what they think. It's becoming easier and easier to do that. And like I said, we tend to prefer and privilege those who are like us or who think like us. And not only that, we're able to shield ourselves from views that we disagree with. So not only do we feel stronger about what we think, we can simply ignore the things that we don't agree with. And lastly, there's this widespread need to win a conversation, that you want to feel superior to someone who disagrees with you. And there are reasons and ways that we go about trying to make someone feel less than to make ourselves feel better. All of these things are headwinds in trying to make some meaningful change. And so in the book, what I talk about is how persuasion works and how it doesn't. And I include these two photos because we sometimes have perceptions of ourselves that we are all Republican or all Democrat, and occasionally something else. But as these photos show, we actually put our brains together with little clips of information, with little pieces of information we tape together. And those are sometimes red and they're sometimes blue. So when we vote, yes, we have to choose red or blue. But when it comes to what we hold in our head in terms of attitudes, it can be as mixed as these pictures. There's a perception that if you can find the perfect thing to say in the perfect way at the perfect time, we can persuade someone, which means I think something, you think something else. And at the end of the conversation, you're going to think what I think. That's not how it works. That's not how it goes. Sometimes I wish it did, but it doesn't. You can think of yourself. I held an opinion. I have my reasons. And no matter what someone says to me, I'm not going to instantly change my thoughts on a dime. And so when you keep that in mind, this isn't how persuasion works. Sorry, I skipped that for a second. Persuasion isn't an event, it's a process. And it's one that takes persistence, forethought, and patience, all of which, myself included, we don't have in large amounts these days. So this is a call to action. Now, I read a whole bunch of very boring social psychological books, so you don't have to. So this is the only time when I'm going to subject you to something that's frankly pretty boring. I find it interesting, but you probably don't. Here's what this is. It's a model written by two scholars, Petty and Cacioppo. And they came up with a model of how people change their mind. So at the top, you'll notice when persuasive communication comes in, what happens in our brains? It can go straight down, which essentially is your attitude is changed over time. It's relatively enduring. It's resistant to counter arguments. It's what we typically think of as persuasion. Your mind is changed, and there you go. The persuasive communication worked. Or it can go to the side in what's known as the peripheral route of persuasion. And here you might change your mind, you might change your attitude for a bit, but likely you're going to retain or regain that initial attitude. It won't be long lasting. And you're not going to change your mind back for a really good reason. And so when I read this book, it's really thick, put me to sleep a couple times. But what I noticed was this very first step right here, motivated to process. If you are not motivated to process information, you are never going to make it down to the meaningful, to the thoughtful, to the enduring level of persuasion that we think is a normatively good thing in this country. So what I wanted to study was, how do you get people to be motivated to process information? And from this model, we know it's things like personal relevance, need for cognition, which is just a psychological trait that you need to understand things, that you have a sense of personal responsibility. It's something that has to be meaningful to you, or else you're not going to process the information that you're given. And so thinking through, how do you talk to people in a way that doesn't alienate them? This is where we start. How to make it personally relevant, how to make it seem like it matters to them. And that's where our story starts. So in the book, I go into much more detail than I will right now, but I lay out 3 chapters on how you might go about doing this, how you can get people motivated to process the information that you offer them. And the first chapter is on information itself. It's on how to present information in the best possible way by thinking about what the person already thinks, considering what they will actually listen to, and listening to what they think initially, so you can craft a strategy to make them think the information that you have is relevant to them. The second, which I'll touch on, is emotion. I don't know about you, but when I talk about politics, emotion is one of the hardest things to get through. People can yell and scream and get pretty fired up for very little these days. So how do we get around that? The third, as I alluded to, is the sense of shared identity, that we have something in common, and that commonality is a way that we can spark a conversation that might be meaningful. And so these are the 3 strategies and tactics that I talk about in the book. And I'd like to go through each of them in a little bit more detail. So in terms of information, as I just said, you have to think about where a person is and where you can reasonably expect them to go. If you know that someone is fervently pro-choice when it comes to abortion, coming to them and expecting them to be fervently pro-life at the end is just not a reasonable expectation. It just isn't. So in the book, I talk about this concept of how we process information in terms of receiving, accepting, and sampling it. And in essence, you need to think about what a person's going to receive in the first place. And if they don't receive it and process it, they're never going to accept it. And they're never going to sample it when it comes time to express an opinion. That won't be a piece of information that they recall. So again, the very first step is, what information will they accept? Now, you might think that you have the strongest piece of information ever, and it's totally convincing to you, but it isn't to them. And that's not going to help you down that road of meaningful change. So a couple examples. If someone says that they don't support the Affordable Care Act, which a lot of people call Obamacare, you can launch into a tirade whether you support it or don't. But until you understand why they think the way that they do, you might be wasting your time. For example, some people don't like the Affordable Care Act because they've had a bad experience with it. Some people don't like it because they think it doesn't go far enough. Some people don't like it because President Obama was the original author, or the original origin of the law. So without knowing which orientation someone has, how are you ever going to engage with them in a conversation without first listening and understanding what information you might be able to provide to them to get them down this road of a good conversation? In the book, I talk about AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and the level of misinformation that people, and the fear that people had in the 1980s and 90s, and even today. And so if you look at, there's a study that showed For people who gave incorrect answers about how HIV and AIDS is transmitted, so in other words, didn't have correct information about the disease, they're overwhelmingly uncomfortable being around people who are HIV positive or are living with AIDS. 61% said that they were very or somewhat uncomfortable. But for people who gave correct answers about it, who knew exactly what the disease was and how it was transmitted, 86% of people said they were very comfortable or somewhat comfortable having an HIV positive or a person living with AIDS in their workplace, handle their food, be a healthcare worker, someone in their life that they're very comfortable with. And the only factor that really predicted this change in support was correct information. And so information, as you know, is wildly important, but only if people are willing to accept it and you can provide it to them in a way that they'll listen. Emotion is one of the hardest ones, I will admit. And when I was writing this part of the book, I thought about the kinds of emotions that people experienced in political conversations that I've had. And so these are the three that I see the most commonly: anger, fear, and anxiety, which are roughly the same, and disgust. So in the book, I talk extensively about sort of making a map of someone's emotion and figuring out what you can do with it. And I know those of you in the room probably can't see this small type, but it is in the book. And I rely on a bioevolutionary scholar named Robert Plutchik, who came up with this thing called the Wheel of Emotion, which sounds like a game show, but it's not. What he does here is he makes this diagram of strength of emotion and how you can downplay the strength of emotion to make it into something that's more palatable. So for example, if someone feels rage, which is the most strongly felt, deeply felt emotion possible, the next step down is anger, and the next step down is annoyance. Now, annoyance might not seem ideal, but it's certainly better than rage. If someone is feeling grief, which is a really, again, heartfelt emotion, the next level down is sadness. The next one down is pensiveness. So in other words, he says, particularly in the animal world, these emotions exist in a way that we can understand in terms of intensity. And that's relevant for persuasion, because if someone is feeling rage, someone is feeling grief, someone's feeling terror, they're probably not going to process the information that you're trying to give them. And so in the book, I give a bunch of examples of ways to lean into some of these things. But in summary, anger can be downplayed or it can be dealt with by leaning in and listening to the angry person. It's really hard. It's very hard. But when someone's angry, they're simply not in a mental headspace to listen to what you have to say. And the only way that you can get to a place where they're going to be more likely to hear you is to listen and make it clear that you understand what they're saying. You don't have to agree, but you have to listen. And at that point, research shows when someone feels that they've been heard, that they've been listened to, that's when they're at a moment of perhaps accepting new information. Fear and anxiety is a pretty classic, particularly in moments of COVID. There's a lot of fear and anxiety going around. And when people feel this emotion, the best way to counteract it is to lessen their uncertainty and to provide them with additional information. So if you sense that someone is fearful or anxious, think through how you can lessen the uncertainty they have about whatever it is that they're fearful or anxious about. Disgust is another one. Disgust is a difficult one, to be honest, but the best way you can is to try to humanize, to try to normalize whatever it is that you're trying to talk about. And looking at the model that I just mentioned, downgrading their emotion to boredom, which essentially means, I guess I don't really care. It's not disgusting to me. It's just not something that I really care about. So the chapter on emotion, I think, has a bunch of great examples of ways to listen, to sort of think through the emotions at play and how to not let them be barriers to continuing conversation. The last substantive chapter, chapter 6, it's a pretty broad one. It has a bunch of things in it that I think would be helpful. And one of those things is appealing to shared identity and values. So leading into the LGBTQ examples or the same-sex marriage examples, in 2013, Pope Francis said during an interview If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge? It's a pretty amazing statement from the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. It wasn't necessarily a statement favoring same-sex marriage. The church is still against that. But essentially he said, I'm not going to judge someone who's different than I am if they have good faith and they have goodwill. And it was a really powerful way to communicate shared identity and shared values. You can be a devout Catholic, someone who believes very strongly in your faith, and still find it in your heart to not judge other people and to even favor rights for them. And so this chapter talks about ways to do that, including personalization, giving someone a specific example of what it is that you're trying to talk to them about, using empathy, position taking, something called moral elevation, which is talking about how good the world is and how magnanimous some people are and how good that makes you feel. Help people think, okay, yeah, the world isn't quite as bad as I might think. And they actually become more likely to listen to what you have to say. To dig into the shared identity factor a little bit deeper, the picture on your left, the black and white photo, is Dolores Huerta, who was a leader of the farm workers movement in California, famously holding a sign that says in Spanish, strike. And it was an iconic photo in her particular movement among Latino and Latina Americans. And in the early 2000s, she created an organization called the Dolores Huerta Foundation. And among the images she shared was one that was recreated to be about marriage equality. And this spoke to Latinos and Latinas in America. And this iconic photo now being used in this new way really spoke to a whole generation of folks. And it's one way to use a sense of shared identity to get someone on board, at least, again, to process what it is that you're telling them. Now, one interesting example in the last several years in particular, athletes have gotten very involved in politics, and not necessarily with wildly different levels of agreement, with folks expressing attitudes about particularly race in this country, kneeling, holding hands, locking arms. There are many examples of how athletes have gotten involved in politics. And these are just a few quick examples that I've noted. There was a debate or a disagreement between Laura Ingraham and LeBron James about whether athletes should just sort of shut up and play their sport, or whether they have a role to play in American political life. LeBron James thinks so, and Laura Ingraham doesn't. Colin Kaepernick is maybe the most famous face of athletes being involved in politics, as he kneeled during the national anthem before NFL games in 2016, but there are a few others. Michael Bennett, who was a defensive end for the Philadelphia Eagles, got involved in politics by changing the traditional red hat to say immigrants make America great rather than make America great again. And yet others, Megan Rapinoe, a Major League Soccer player at the time, players in the WNBA team, the Atlanta Dream, which was owned by then Senator Kelly Loeffler. They supported her opponent and wore these shirts to support her opponent during a WNBA game. Now, why am I bringing this up? It made me wonder, oh, sorry, there's one more. Tim Tebow is another famous athlete who has gotten involved in other ways, expressing his Christian faith by kneeling not during the national anthem, but prior to games. And he said very publicly that he's Christian, he's proud of being Christian, and he kneeled to pray before a game, to ask for God's blessing and help during the game. So where I was going, why do we care about all of these things? As a social scientist, I wanted to know, is this particular shared identity something that matters to people? Is this something that can help bridge divides between people who have this particular identity in common, even in something as unrelated as same-sex marriage? And so you're in Michigan, I'm in Minnesota, our neighbor in between us is Wisconsin. And I don't know about you, but I don't know too many more fervent fans than Packers fans. Seem like the perfect place to test our theory. I don't have too many numbers for you tonight, but this is one study. We'll have just a few numbers for you. What we did is we went to Lawrence University in Appleton, recruited some students who were on the street handing out surveys, and if they were completed, they handed a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts gift card. And what they wanted to know was, can you use shared identity in a way that changes attitudes about something that has nothing to do with sports? So in this experiment, people either received a photo of Leroy Butler, a very well-known Packer who's in the Hall of Fame and did a local radio show, or Jay-Z, who had nothing to do with sports. So in other words, one person triggered this shared sense of identity among Packers fans. And if you weren't a Packers fan, probably didn't matter which photo you saw. But they, in our estimation, were about as similar to each other as you could get, with the only major thing being this sports fan identity. So what we found, like I said, not very many numbers, but this is the only one. For people who didn't support the Packers, it didn't matter which picture they saw or whose support they learned about. There was no statistical difference between the Jay-Z condition or the Leroy Butler condition. Didn't matter. But for Packers fans, it mattered a whole bunch, almost 15 percentage points difference, from 63% to almost 78%. Now, this makes perfect sense, right? A Packers fan hears Jay-Z's support, and they're roughly where the non-fans were. But they hear, oh, one of us, someone that shares this really powerful and important identity to me, supports this thing. Much like President Obama or Dick Cheney, that number went up because either people said, hey, this is something that I should pay attention to, or B, this is something that I sort of thought before, but now that I know this person who's just like me thinks this, hey, that gives me permission to think the same thing. And so in the book, we give even more examples of this phenomenon, but it's true. The sense of shared identity is a really powerful way to get through to other people. So in summary, I'm eager to hear your questions. Disagreement's okay. We don't all have to think the same thing. We don't all have to be the same people. In fact, disagreement's been baked into our political system in many ways. And so the goal is not to get rid of disagreement. It's just finding a way to do it better with the people around us. And importantly, it's not about being civil or just being nice. And that's kind of a misnomer. I think in politics, there are sometimes times when we should yell and scream and protest and claw with all our might to try to get change when something is so unjust. We shouldn't be afraid to raise our voice. But I argue that's actually a pretty small portion of the time. Most of the time, in terms of political communication, it's with folks who are around us, either people in our house, people at our work, people that we know, people that we see at our kids' baseball game or at the grocery store. And in that sense, it's not the time to yell and scream and burn everything down, because if we all have a let's scorch the earth policy, the only thing that we'll get at the end is an earth where nothing grows. And that's certainly not what we need or what we want in this country. So it's not about being nice necessarily. It's being thoughtful. It's being strategic. And it's all about thinking about where someone is likely to go. As I mentioned, it's not about changing their mind with one conversation. That's never going to happen. But if you can think about reasonable goals, if you can think about ways that you can behave in conversation, you can be successful. And again, in the book, I talk about it in much more detail, but using information, neutralizing emotion in the sense of shared identity. And when it comes down to it, you can't change the behavior of others as much as we'd like to. I would love to be able to tell everyone, hey, talk to each other better, but I can't do that. The only thing I can change is how I talk to people. And even though it's wildly unsatisfying, it's not quick, it's not easy, but if I change the way that I talk to other people, very slowly, change can come. And that's really the only thing that I have control over. So what should you take away? What can you do? Aside from buy the book, that would be a good thing to do. One thing is add to your news diet. What I mean by this is think about what constitutes broccoli for you in terms of news? Things that you will eat, but you don't like it. And whatever that is, add it to your news diet. Now, if you're a conservative, I'm not asking you to listen to Rachel Maddow every night. If you're a progressive or a liberal, I'm not asking you to watch Fox News every night, but find what meets in the middle. Something that you don't hate, but maybe something you wouldn't choose if you had a choice. The second thing, and it takes practice, and let me tell you, it takes practice. You got to keep your cool. I promise you can do it. But don't get goaded into the same old debates with people, because we know that insanity is getting ourselves in the same situation and expecting a different result. So making an earnest effort to keep your cool, to go through some of the steps that I identified tonight that are also in the book, it really can make a difference. And I can tell you, it has in my life. I have people of all ideologies and all partisans in my world. And it's a daily process, but I promise you that it can work. Third thing, it's easy to fixate on what other people do. Well, my neighbor who thinks something else than I am yells at me every time we talk about politics. Or my family, when we get to the Thanksgiving table, behaves terribly. It's no fun. But rather than fixating on what other people do, what you can focus on is what you do in response. And again, it's hard. It can feel unsatisfying, but you can't always change others, but you can always change yourself. And the last thing is you have to practice. You're not going to be good at talking about politics with people who disagree overnight. Think of times when you can bring up politics in a conversation and act in a way that others know that you care what they think, even if it's not what you think. And be willing to fail. You will fail. I did too. Sometimes I lose my cool. Sometimes I say things that I want to take back. But at the end of the day, the change that we need in this country is never going to happen if everyone is too afraid to start. And so embrace having it be awkward and a little uncomfortable. I promise a little discomfort never hurt anybody, but it can do a whole lot of good in our deliberative democracy. I want to end with a quote. I like to begin and end with one. This by the Reverend Desmond Tutu. Don't raise your voice, improve your argument. And it's true. No one ever changed their mind from someone yelling at them. I know I certainly haven't. So what we need to do in this country to get back on track, to get closer to the ideals that we can agree on, isn't to continue to yell at each other. It's to think through how we talk to each other, how to improve our argument, and how to get back to sitting at our kitchen tables and talking to people we love in a way that shows that we respect what they have to think too. And with that, that is the end of the presentation. I'm happy to take your questions, and I think maybe I'll stop sharing, but I can bring up the presentation again if there's a slide that you want to talk about.
There's some questions. I see one, I think, online, and I'll read that before I read it out loud. Is there a question here live in the audience yet? There's one.
Thank you, Brian, for joining us tonight. It's been very informative, and I look forward to buying your book. I'll bet I have a question that other people are asking as well. When 63 courts have turned down the big lie, what do you say? How do you approach people who still believe that President Biden didn't win the election? Where do you start?
What I say to that is, whenever something that I view as factually correct and someone else doesn't agree that it's factually correct, I want to know what they're basing their opinion on. So someone says, oh, the election was stolen. Okay, why do you think that? And it's interesting what information we get just from asking such a simple question. People will either sometimes admit, I don't know, I just heard it. I heard it. Okay. Well, why don't we listen to the Republican secretaries of state of some of the states that counted their votes? They agree that the election was fair. So, hey, people like us, Republicans, although they didn't like the outcome, they admitted, yeah, this is what happened. These are the true votes. Vice President Mike Pence oversaw removing himself from office. Can you imagine how that feels? But he looked at the data and he said, no, these elections are certified, they are fair, and we have to admit the truth sometimes. And that's how I do it. Sometimes I'll take people to, the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, for example, was very outspoken about the election being free and fair in Georgia, the count being accurate. And so maybe show some of his comments. The electoral vote certifications are part of our public record. And you can go to the archives and actually look at the electoral vote counts that are certified by all of the members of the Senate. And so that's what I recommend and it doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't take a lot of time. Having a couple things in the back of your head to keep with you in case these conversations come up is generally how I do it. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And you know what happens? You can go home and say, gosh, that went badly. I wish I could do that differently. You can. It's not permanent. You can call out that person and say, hey, guess what? I was really thinking about what we talked about. I found some new information about what happened in the state or wherever you are. And hey, can I send it to you? Because I've been thinking about what you said. And who's not going to say, no, don't send me that? They're going to say, oh, hey, they listened to what I had to say. They were thinking about it. And most of the time, people will continue the conversation.
We're good now. He can hear us.
I can't. Okay, the question is, I found your book, A Change is Going to Come, and this person has requested that we have an interlibrary loan system throughout the state. But the person does not see your newest book, and she doesn't see it on Amazon either. Who is the publisher and what is the copyright data?
Sure. So I have 4 books. All of them are on Amazon. So I'm not sure. If you search for Brian F. Harrison, F as in Frank, that's my middle initial, they're all on there. 3 of the 4 are with Oxford University Press. They are in Oxford University Press. And they're from 2017, 2020, and 2020. I had a busy 2020. I had a new book that just came out in 2022, just about 6 weeks ago. And it's with a publisher called ABC Clio. But if you can go to my website, brianharrison.net, and all of them are there. So that gives you all the information you would need to request them on the loan system.
Okay, great.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for being here tonight. I have not read your books, so I don't know the full extent of your knowledge, obviously. And I wouldn't have gained it in just an hour. So I'm going to ask this question from the standpoint of what you presented tonight. And what you presented tonight was an outline of how to convince someone that you're right and they're not. I didn't hear what happens if, after you've leaned in and listened, do you change your mind and accept the other person's point of view? Could you address that?
Sure. I wouldn't characterize it as ways to get people to think what you do. I think it's a conversation. It's how to craft a conversation, because it's really easy to shut a conversation down at the beginning of it, right? Someone says something about politics and you can say, well, you're an idiot. You're wrong. That stops the conversation. So what I laid out tonight was how to not stop the conversation, how to keep it going. Strategies that social science tells us increases the likelihood that people will continue to be in conversation with you. And part of being in conversation with someone else is, yeah, you can change your mind as well. Absolutely, it happens all the time. But it isn't just about changing your mind. Talking about politics isn't just about me thinking something and you thinking something else and one person changing as a result of the conversation. I do talk in the book quite a bit about how there's other values or other value to political conversations. You can better understand someone else's worldview. You can think that you know what they think and feel, but when they tell it to you, you can be completely wrong. You can increase just the fact that you like each other more by talking more civilly and respectfully. And no, you're not going to change their mind and they're not going to change yours. But you know what? The next time that a conversation arises or the opportunity for one arises, you're going to be more likely to talk to that person because they showed you respect the last time. And that's how persuasion works. It's a series of conversations. And that's really where change happens. So no, I don't think that this is just about getting people to think what you do. I think it's about being open to hearing what they think and then engaging in conversation in a way that doesn't alienate them. And that's sometimes the best way to start.
Is there any follow-up? Other questions? There is one person who does say, and Brian, you talked about this just a bit ago when you answered the previous question. I find that the biggest challenge is finding the time to try to have the facts sort of on hand and then trying to remember them.
So not everyone is a political scientist like me, I totally admit. And so what I would recommend is if you feel like you're, what's the phrase? Ahead of your skis is the phrase, right? Don't wing it. Just listen to what the person has to say and then go home and read a little bit about it and then get back to them, email them, call them. You don't have to have the pressure of, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity. I have to bring all of this information and do it in the perfect way. You can, like I said, it's not a one and done. But if you can have an interaction with someone during this conversation where you don't insult them, you don't shame them, and they don't do the same to you, or maybe they do, but you can come back and say, hey, I've really been thinking about this. And when we were talking, I didn't have the right information, but hey, I found this thing and I want to send it to you. It really does work. This happens all the time where someone says something and I'm like, I know that doesn't sound right. I don't believe that, but I don't know for sure. So I go home, I read about it, I think about it, and sometimes they're right. Sometimes the thing that I thought was surely wrong is actually right on the money. And great, I learned something new. If it's not, it gives me the opportunity to dig in a little bit more and to share with them what I found. And so a lot of people have trouble with confrontation. They don't want to make things contentious and to make things awkward. And I understand that. And that's one strategy I use to take the heat off the moment, get home, figure it out, and then engage again.
Other questions? My link just went out, Thomas, so do you see any further chats? I'm just trying to reconnect, but it's... Yes, there's one over here.
A lot of times I find that the people that aren't thinking the same way I do or aren't engaging in conversations with the same background as mine, they have different information from different sources. And like, I was teaching a group of 7th graders some research, and one young lady went to a website when she was doing a report on Minnesota. Well, she went to, no, I guess it was Wyoming. She went to the city of Wyoming and took all her facts from the city instead of the state. So she was getting erroneous information. I have friends who are doing the same thing. They're getting erroneous information because they're not going to sources that are accurate. How do you combat that?
Yeah, it's tough.
How do you work with that?
Combat is violent imagery, I guess, right? No, I get what you're saying. It's tough. And like I say in the book, I'm not going to lie, this isn't easy for anybody. But for in this situation, what I typically do, and it happens a lot with my own family members, I'll find information that I think they will listen to. It takes a little digging. But like I said, if I have a family member who is really liberal and they think all sort of liberal talking points, I think, okay, I'm going to have to get something that they're going to listen to at all, or else they're not going to process that information. So maybe I'll go to the New York Times, or maybe I'll find something from something that I think they'll actually listen to. But if I send them something from Fox News, they're just not going to, they're not even going to read it. They're not even going to regard it at all. And so that's my strategy. I try to find something that I think they're going to at least read. Now, you're not going to change their mind with this one piece of information. And chances are they're going to say, nope, I already have my information and I don't need it anymore. And you can't change that. When I was talking about you can't change others, you can only change yourself. Sometimes the best you can do is to put out good information into the world and to do it in a way that increases the likelihood that someone's going to use it, but you can't force them. So sometimes, I'm trying to think of a good example. I got into disagreements with someone, they have their information and I have mine. And again, I could say, well, wow, what an idiot you are for thinking this other thing. Well, that's never going to work. So I find information that I think that they might actually attend to at some point, send it to them and they say, no, I already know what I think. But sure enough, after a couple of weeks, sometimes they'll come back and say, oh, hey, I read that thing that you sent me. I guess it's not totally wrong. It's not totally awful. I say, oh, okay. And then we can start a conversation from that point. Other times they say, forget it. I'm never going to read what you sent me. Either way, I put good stuff out into the world, things that I am proud of, things that I know are good sources. And, you know, if that's the best outcome, that's the best outcome. You can't force other people to drink the water. You can only get them as close to it as you can. But for your student, she really should know the difference between a city and a state. That I think is a pretty safe one.
Some things we think might be easy. Setting by a state. I have a question here. We have a minute. You talk about sort of anger, rage. Oh, I don't know whether is that mine. What?
There, I have to, oh, I keep going back and forth. There we go. The politics is something that just brings out from 0 to 180 anger, you know, or that pumped up. And somebody's, you know, when I'll say, you know, I might even step back if we're standing, you know, range, and I'll say, you know, just can you speak at a lower voice or softer or whatever? And it's like, well, I get excited. This is what I do. I mean, you know, are there strategies, and anybody, Brian, or anybody in the room that work effectively rather than, oh, don't do all that psychobabble on me, you know, or, you know, I'm just having fun here. And this is, as I said, this is what I do. That's always I've just never know quite how to handle that and keep a conversation going without my then matching that, and then that doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple ideas. But if anyone in the room does too, I'd love to hear them. For the way I approach it is a couple of different things. One, humor always works. It depends on who the person is, but if it's someone that you know pretty well, think of a way to disarm them with humor. It always works. And you can say, oh gosh, I can't even come up with a joke off the top of my head, but disarm the situation to where they realize that they're not matching your same level of intensity. Psychologically speaking, people don't like to feel completely disparate in terms of energy from the other person they're talking to, particularly someone they know. So in other words, if someone's yelling at you and you're whispering at them, they're going to quiet down. Doesn't always happen. If it's a stranger, they might keep yelling at you. But again, if it's someone that you know, keeping your energy level low and not engaging at the same level that they are will eventually get them back down, right? Also, making a joke. The other thing is physical contact. If it's someone that you know, obviously, put your hand on their shoulder, put your hand, you know, touch their arm. Say, oh my gosh, I certainly don't want to yell at each other. I just want to talk about this thing. That's how I handle it, and most often it works. It's sometimes we forget that these are other people, and it's so easy to match their intensity and yell and scream right back, and it feels good for a moment. But then after that moment passes, you realize it was a missed opportunity. And so, like I said, a lot of times it doesn't work. People yell at me and I keep my energy level low, and I use all the things that I've talked about tonight, and they keep yelling at me. And I think, well, that's no fun. I don't want to do that again anytime soon. But I go home and I think, you know what? The best that I could do in that situation is not engage in the same things they're doing. And hey, you know, I'll fight to fight. No, I'll live to engage another day. And you do the best you can, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Other questions? And I don't see anything more on chat. Well, Brian, thank you very much for stopping by tonight. And have a
course.
good rest of the spring break for you.
Thank you very much. And if you can find me on social media, you can find my website. And if you read my book and you don't agree, send me a note and we can talk about it.